So good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Etionio Larondo, Director of the Melissa Institute for Violence Prevention and Treatment. So we have people from all over the world today and all over the nation. It's an exciting morning for us. And the reason you're all here is because Don is leading the talk today. And so Don needs very little introduction. As you know, Don Meichenbaum is one of the founders of the Melissa Institute. He has been our research director for the past 25 years. And he has been he's a clinical psychologist and one of the founders of cognitive behavioral therapy. A few years ago, in a survey of clinicians, he was voted one of the 10 most influential psychotherapists of the 20th century. And among his many accolades, he was given a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Clinical Division of the American Psychological Association. He has many more accolades, and he's published extensively, and most relevant to the topic that we're discussing today. He published a book called Ways to Bolster Resilience across the entire lifespan that he has made available to folks for free, and we'll provide you with the information on how to obtain that book if you wish to do so. And beside that, all I can tell you is that you have no idea what a pleasure it is for me and for our staff to work day in and day out with Don. He's a brilliant man. He has a great heart and an inspiration for all of us. And I'll say no more. I'll leave you now with Don.
Well, thank you for that gracious invitation, and let me thank all of you for your attendance and interest, and moreover, commend you on your good judgment in being here. I cannot think of a more timely topic that society in general faces and the mental health community in particular need to address. As I was preparing for this presentation, I was figuring, how do you maintain or establish resilience given the kind of data that we're confronted with each day when you listen to the news? And in the United States, for example, there are 1,000 people dying each day from COVID, moving us towards 800,000 as a total. There's 109 shootings each day in the United States. And thus far this year, there have been 650 mass shootings where 4 or more people have died. The incidence of violence towards oneself and towards others continue to increase in terms of the increased likelihood of suicides, especially among healthcare providers like nurses and doctors and the like. We've also had increased violence in terms of shelter in place. The National Association Surgeon General has declared an emergency for teenagers in particular who experience remarkable high incidence of anxiety and depression, given the losses due to COVID. We now live with the uncertainty of yet more variants. How do we come to understand what we can do as healthcare providers and society in general in order to bolster resilience? So in order to address this, I have put together a book called Roadmap to Resilience. And in fact, that's the book that Etionio was commenting on. I had been asked to consult at various hospitals for the healthcare staff, Mayo Clinic and other hospitals, and decided that the book that I put together on ways to bolster resilience would be perhaps of service. And I'm now 81 years of age and in what Erik Erikson calls the generativity phase of life. So I decided to put the book online for free. I guess if you put anything on for free, it has some kind of impact. I'm proud to say that as of this moment, some 35,000 people around the world have downloaded it in 127 countries. In the UN, there's only 197 countries plus the Vatican. So I'm on my way towards covering that. So if you go to Roadmap to Resilience wordpress.com, you will be able to click on that and go to Appendix A and B, which will enumerate a whole variety of challenges that individuals have. And if you click on any one of them, it's like a how-to version. So let me give you a bit of a game plan as we're going to proceed. I'm going to take the first 45 minutes and talk about the nature and impact of trauma and moreover on resilience. Now, here's the good news to actually appreciate from the outset. And the good news is that no matter what kind of victimization or trauma that people experience, including prolonged and complicated grief, traumatic bereavements, whether it's due to natural disasters, social climate, whether it's due to COVID, whether it's due to some form of violence, most people are impacted. But 75% go on to evidence resilience or the ability to bounce back, to deal with ongoing adversities. 25% of folks tend to get stuck. As my colleague, scientific board member, Sherry Hamby, who also did a presentation on this topic, in fact, you can download it, has noted that trauma is everywhere, but so is resilience. And as we will come to see, the good stuff is in fact more powerful in influencing life, communities, families than is the bad stuff. So I have recently been involved in doing multiple Zoom presentations. I just did 16 hours for psychotherapists in Chinese. And in fact, a portion of this presentation, if you're so disposed, will appear on the website in Chinese. And I'm in the midst of doing a legacy course. You know, the message is that the best measure of a person is in part the legacy that they're leaving. So I'm in the midst of doing a 30-hour presentation on that topic that will be available. One thing that I've come to notice, and I need to offer an apology right from the outset, is that as I watch those videos, I notice that my eyes appear closed. And the apology is that I have lost complete sight in the right eye, and I have a droopy eyelid. And in the left side, I have macular degeneration. So I want to assure you that if my eyes appear closed in the presentation, I am as eager and excited of sharing this material as anything. So I think if we want to understand resilience, it will also behoove us to start off by learning PTSD. Now, I only have 2 hours here, and I will note that I have given, for example, this summer, a 15-hour workshop just on this particular topic. So I'm condensing all of this into these 2 45-minute presentations plus the question and answer. So put on your seatbelt. I'm going to move you through this rather quickly. I did take the liberty, and I hope you find it useful, to provide the detailed handout that I used for this more extensive workshop. Moreover, if you go to the Melissa Institute website, the face page, and click on Resilience Resources, this will take you to a plethora of papers by myself and other scientific board members that address this topic of resilience and trauma and various ways to cope with it. So I'm not a big fan of PowerPoint, so therefore my obsessive academic style comes out in these extensive handouts. And you will also have access on the face page. The most important information is in fact my email address, which is dhmeich@aol.com. And if I don't get to your questions or your comments here, please feel free to email me down the road. Okay, let's start off. What is PTSD? Well, PTSD is essentially a disorder of non-recovery. That is, as I noted, that in the aftermath of victimization and trauma, most people are impacted, but 75% go on to evidence resilience. In fact, there's a percentage of them who even go on to evidence what Tedeschi and Calhoun call post-traumatic growth. And we'll talk about what is the journey that people can take you through. So what is it that distinguishes the 75% versus the 25%? clearly, if we as healthcare providers want to be of service, it would be relevant and useful to find out what the 75% are doing. So God forbid something bad happens to you and you happen to be falling into the 75% group of people who are resilient. I'm going to provide you with an algorithm of exactly how you could screw up your life. As you will see, PTSD is really a reflection of an autobiographical memory. That is, something bad has happened to a person recently or sometime in the past, for example, as a result of adverse childhood experiences. And I'm going to advocate that what distinguishes the 75% versus the 25% are indeed the nature of the stories that people tell themselves and tell others, and the accompanying coping responses that get paired along with that story. I'm going to challenge each of you to think of yourselves not only as Homo sapiens, but as Homo narrans, that is, storytellers. So what are the features of the stories that people tell themselves? What is that people who get stuck in PTSD and co-occurring disorders? What's the nature of what their processes are like? And as you'll see in table 1 of the handout, we can identify the number of cognitive, emotional, behavioral, and most importantly, spiritual kinds of struggles that keep people in that 25% group. In fact, the use of spirituality is the major way, especially in North America and throughout the world, whereby people cope with some form of trauma and victimization. And being engaged in some kind of spiritual struggle is often a contributing factor where people feel that God has abandoned them, or they're angry, or they're chosen, and the like. But let's work through some of the other component processes and then consider what are the kinds of treatment implications therein. So here's your formula, your algorithm to understand better what it is that people do. I've put this together based on my own clinical experience over 50 years and a kind of excerpt from the literature and what I think it shows in terms of what characterizes those people who seem to get stuck. One of the things that comes out clearly in these longitudinal studies is that if something bad has happened to a person, to a family, to a community, insofar as they keep that story secret, it has a telltale sign and has poor consequences down the road. And note that the requirement is not to share it just with a therapist, or even to do so in a verbal kind of fashion. There are many ways of expressing artistically and otherwise the nature of the kinds of victimizations. When in fact these trauma and victimizations have occurred, language is often inadequate to describe what people have been through. So in some sense, people become kinds of poets of sorts. They say, you can't believe what it's like. You know, I'm telling you, I'm a prisoner of the past. I'm a pariah. I'm a doormat. I'm a burden on others. And I'm going to argue, given my emphasis on a narrative perspective, that one of the things that is that these figures of speech, these metaphors, are actually a lens through which people see themselves, the relationship with others, and their future. That is, when these traumatic events occur, they shatter one's belief, as Janet Bullman and others have highlighted, the sense of safety, the sense of security, your sense of trust, your own sense of self-worthiness. Moreover, people are more likely during the aftermath of these kinds of victimizations to engage in a variety of activities, avoidance, for example, either avoiding to try to think about the traumatic event or avoiding going back into the situations where the event occurs. We now know from research that that kind of avoidance has a boomerang effect and actually leads to more intrusive ideation. Other kinds of features that I enumerate that are relevant here have to do with the degree to which people ruminate. You can't really have psychopathology without ruminating, without dwelling on it, without going back over old anger and the like. You may also engage in what is called contrafactual thinking, of engaging in why me, why now, and the like. One of the other kinds of features that comes in here is that people get caught up in some kind of thinking traps of absolutistic thinking, of tyranny of the shoulds and the wants and other kinds of things. They may have perfectionistic standards. They tend to magnify their fears. And all of these components, the social comparison, the delaying and seeking help, the degree to which people engage in non-negative thinking, as we will see, actually comes to produce a kind of resilient behavior. I have become preoccupied with resilience for some time. As you'll see in your handout, a few facts about resilience is worth keeping in mind from the outset, as we're going to try and bolster it as we go along. People could be resilient at one time in their lives and not others. In fact, there are studies of African-American youth who were resilient before getting into college, but then they evidence a whole variety of academic stresses and interpersonal stresses and discrimination and like, and their resilience waned. In fact, people who are written in that area have called this kind of skin deep kind of resilience. In fact, one could be resilient in one domain of one's life and not in other domains. It's also important as we consider resilience to keep in mind that resilience and traumatic events can coexist. That the struggles are not an either or proposition. And in fact, if you take the liberty of downloading the Roadmap to Resilience book, I have included a variety of examples of individuals who are struggling with both of these events. In fact, when I give workshops, I show videos of these folks. Unfortunately, because it's on internet, all of the patients that I've seen who illustrate these points cannot be shown on the internet in order to violate any privacy they may experience. Now, as Ann Maston has highlighted, resilience isn't something special. It's a kind of what she calls ordinary magic, and that everybody can, in some sense, increase their level of resilience. And as we're going to discuss in some detail, there are certain kinds of building blocks of resilience that we're going to look at in some detail. One of the key building blocks that has a lot of implications for interventions is the degree to which we can help individuals deal with the aftermath of that kind of victimization, especially in terms of any kind of emotion regulation. We'll see that the exposure to some kind of victimization and trauma actually has bodily sequelae. As Bessel van der Kolk in his best-selling book highlights, the body keeps score, and I have included in your handout, I'm not going to take time to read all that here, the neurological, neuropsychological kind of sequelae of this, especially in developing children. But here is the critically important news. That is, the body also keeps score of people engaging in resilience engendering behaviors. In fact, I had a debate with Bessel van der Kolk not too long ago, where I thought, if he is so detailed in enumerating the sequelae of exposure to victimization, like adverse childhood experiences and the like, I'm going to make sure you get the rest of the story. And especially insofar as people can engage in a variety of coping strategies that I'll take you through and the ways in which we can help enhance them. That also not only changes the structure and function of the brain at the neurotransmitter level, but most fascinatingly, it's now impacting the role of gene expression. You know, we always think of biology, inheritance infecting behavior. We now know that behavior can, in fact, go backwards and also have an impact on gene expression and the like. That's exciting. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. In this emotion regulation, which is one of the cornerstones of this process, is the degree to which people can evidence and engage in a whole bunch of positive emotions, what Fredrickson calls building and broadening one's emotions of gratitude and forgiveness, of compassion, of experiencing a sense of awe, of engaging in some kind of positive emotions, of humor, of engaging in exercise. All of those kinds of positive emotions that we can encourage our patients to experience becomes really important. A second key building block that we're going to highlight is the nature and significant one, the foundational one of social supports. When we talk in the second part after the questions about the ways in which to bolster resilience in high-risk children and their families, adolescents, adults, and elderly and therapists, and as I move you through that literature, you will see that the nature and social supports are really critical. In fact, I'll share with you an anecdote of my own family that highlights the significant role of these kinds of social supports. And then the final kind of building block that we need to address is some kind of meaning-making activity, that people are able to transform their significant losses and pain, the traumatic experience they encounter, into some kind of transformative effort, that they can make a gift of it. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist, the Holocaust survivor who wrote the telling book, A Man's Search for Meaning, noted that as long as people have a why in their lives, they can almost deal with any kind of how. So think of the origins of the Melissa Institute and the way in which, in a courageous fashion, Dr. Michael Attman and Lynn Attman transformed their significant loss of Melissa into a gift of creating this website that has now been this Melissa Institute, which has now been in existence for 25 years, of which I've been privileged and honored to be the research director. But it's not only the Attmans, it's Mothers Against Drunk Driving, it's the Trevor Project. And I can give you examples down the road of many other cases that use various forms of religiosity or other kinds of ways in which they make a gift of their experience for others. What am I saying? Trauma is everywhere. Resilience is also everywhere. That the good stuff is more important than the bad stuff. That trauma and victimization, like the pileup of adverse childhood experience, can take neurological sequelae, especially if it's threat related and also accompanied by deprivation. And as we'll see later on with regard to children, how it can have neurological impact that has major treatment implications. But if we're in the business of trying to nurture resilience, when we can look upon ways in which we can help individuals deal with the immediate aftermath, helping them develop interventions that address the sleep disturbance, the intrusive ideation, the avoidance behavior. Insofar as we can help them develop a variety of emotion regulation techniques, of trying to help them deal with distress tolerance, develop self-soothing techniques, engage in mindfulness activities, learn relaxations, learn both intra and interpersonal coping skills as part of our therapeutic efforts. This will move us along in this particular fashion. The degree to which people can access those individuals who are supportive agents. And note that the nature of the support may not only be present there. We'll talk about under grief, for instance, the way in which therapists are now using techniques like an empty chair, Gestalt empty chair, to have people carry on conversations with the deceased, their loved ones, with moral mentors. In fact, there's a number of constructive narrative therapeutic procedures that I cite that contribute to this. And then finally, that we engage in some kind of meaning making. Now, I have spent the last 50 years listening to people's stories. And I have become a voyeur and exquisite listener to the language that people use that distinguish whether they're going to fall in the 75% group or 25% group. Not only are our patients storytellers, but so are therapists. So here's my first story, permit your indulgences therein. So how did I come to this kind of constructive narrative view? When I was interviewed about the origins of cognitive behavior modification, I could actually give a rather scholarly account all the way from Freud to Genet to Korzybski to Ellis, Beck, George Kelly, and onward. But, when I was pressed, I said, the real origins of cognitive behavior therapy came with my mother, my Jewish mother in the Bronx. Let me tell you what influence she had on me, and then in turn, how it shows up in the therapy. When my father died, my mother went back to work. And she would be at work and come home and have dinner with my two sisters and I. Now, my mother would come home often with stories. Now, my mother had a rather unique way of telling stories, because not only would she tell what happened to her during the course of the day. Sadie asked me to move some boxes. I moved the boxes. I hurt my back, and I know Donnie told me I shouldn't move the boxes. And so she would not only tell us what happened, she would also share with us her thoughts and feelings that she experienced during the course of that particular event. And moreover, she had a particular knack, because she would then provide a commentary on which were adaptive thoughts and which were maladaptive. It's bad enough I got depressed, so why should I suffer, right? So I decided not to do Tala. There's no sense. So I realized that I ate dinner with this woman every night during my entire high school and college career. So what did I do? I went off to the University of Illinois and got a Ph.D. in clinical psychology. So what did I do for my dissertation? I taught schizophrenics how to talk to themselves. They're doing it anyway. So when I teach them to edit, can I teach them to regulate? Not only that, I went from there to the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. And what I do there? I taught all kinds of people in Ontario to do what my mother does all the time. So we taught kids who were impulsive and hyperactive to think before they act. People with anger to be attentive to how they perceive provocations as personal threats. And people who have PTSD to become better listeners and start to see the impact therein. And you know what I did? I called what my mother did cognitive behavior therapy. I became one of the 10 topmost informed. I don't understand the big deal. We get paid as therapists to listen to people's stories. So what is it that makes us distinguish from listening to their stories from all the other people they could tell their stories to, right? They could tell their stories to their mother and figure. They could tell their stories to their bartender, to their hairdresser. What is it that I bring to bear in listening to people's stories that makes me worth being paid for? Well, the first thing I do is I develop a good quality of therapeutic alliance. It turns out that the quality and nature of therapeutic alliance, the degree to which I'm non-judgmental, compassionate, attentive, reflective, providing accurate empathy. In fact, my wife asked me, why don't I ever do this with her? I say, if you paid me $150 an hour, I would do this with you on a regular basis. The Therapeutic Alliance is in fact 3 to 4 times more influential than any specific intervention that you could provide. So not only do I listen to the stories, I have a way of telling the stories back. And you'll see this in the handout or in any of the other presentations that can go online on the Melissa Insett website. So I say to them, it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong. And what I do is I say to them, it sounds to me, and I put my hand at this imaginary 12 o'clock. And 12 o'clock are the external, internal triggers of the story they just told me. And then I slowly move my hand around. And 3 o'clock is the nature of the primary and secondary emotions, the feelings that they have. So I say, Don, when that happened, when that happened, how'd that make you feel? And it's interesting, as a therapeutic technique that I'll share with you very quickly, that you can look upon those feelings as a commodity. And I can say, Don, what'd you do with all those feelings? I stuffed them, I drank them away, I hit the bitch, you know. And Don, if you did that with all those feelings, what is the impact? What's the toll? What's the price you and others pay? To which the client might say, I don't know. To which I say, I don't know either. And then I slowly move my hand around to 6 o'clock. And 6 o'clock are the nature of the thinking processes, the automatic thoughts and images, the thinking styles, the developmental schemas. And 9 o'clock are the specific behaviors and the resultant consequences. So what am I doing here? I'm not only listening to people's stories, I'm retelling the story back to them so they come to appreciate the interconnection between the way in which they appraise events 12 o'clock, the accompanying feelings that are elicited by it, the kinds of thoughts, behaviors, and resultant consequences. I then say to them, it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's just a vicious. And I slowly move my hand around that imaginary clock without finishing the sentence. If you try this with your clients, I could assure you there's a high probability that they will finish the sentence and say cycle or cycle. And then you put it back in their lap and say, wait a second, are you telling me or are you telling yourself that when this occurs, you do what? 9 o'clock. And then you have the feelings of, and what you do with those feelings are, and you have the thought of. So I want my clients to appreciate that when they tell me the story, I'm going to help them appreciate how they inadvertently, unwittingly, and unknowingly come to produce the very kinds of complaints that they have. I'm going to get them to collect data if in fact this vicious cycle as they describe it actually occurs. And then I'm going to ask in a collaborative fashion, what could we do to help you handle this? Your client doesn't have to be a scientist to say that maybe one of the things he should do is break the cycle. And I'm going to try and explore with them, how do they break the cycle? And what is the impact, toll, and price of them doing just that? Unfortunately, they're in the presence of a therapist who can help them learn better ways of breaking the cycle. So instead of my clients seeing themselves as crazy or sick, I just want them to appreciate that they had a goal in mind. And they chose a way to achieve that goal that may get them in trouble. I want them to appreciate the resources they bring in. I want them to attend to the rest of the story. We have developed a whole variety of therapeutic procedures using time limits, collaborative goal setting, and the like, that over the course of the 15 hours, I walk people through. Hopefully this little anecdote of using the clock gives you a flavor of the way in which I proceed therapeutically. Here's the interesting piece of that anecdote. There is no story that a significant other in your life, whether a patient, a relative, a friend, a coworker, will bring to you, no complaint, nothing, that you can't break down into 12 o'clock, external, internal triggers, 3 o'clock, primary and secondary feelings, 6 o'clock, the automatic thoughts and kinds of stories people tell themselves, 9 o'clock, the behaviors and reactions of others. Knowing that you can think about that as applying to your own self. How do we bolster people's resilience? We establish and maintain a good therapeutic alliance. Not only that, there is a critical need for us to evaluate how good that therapeutic alliance is on a session-by-session feedback basis. Unfortunately, one of the things when you get to my presentation on what makes someone an expert therapist, one of the things that we know is that therapists are not very good at judging how good the therapeutic alliance is. You know, one of my important tenets, apropos of the work of Scott Miller, whose presentation is on the Melissa Institute, about using feedback-informed treatment, is really the critical, the way in which you individualize and tailor the intervention. This will become apparent as I talk about this in the second portion of this presentation. And the degree to which we can systematically assess for the nature of their emotion regulation skills, what they've used in the past, what are the survival mechanisms. Not only do I want the story of what they experienced, I need to ascertain the rest of the story. One of the things we know about people who have PTSD is that the nature of the stories that they drive are often disjointed. They are often sensory driven. Ehlers and Clark and others have highlighted the degree to which people tend to catastrophize. That keeps them in the 25% group. In fact, given that traumatic events are a slice of life often, maybe a long-term slice of life, there is now an increasing appreciation, given this kind of constructive narrative perspective, that we don't really cure PTSD. What we do is we help people access positive autobiographical memories in which they embed the traumatic event. We help them call up the rest of the story. We help them find meaning-making activities. We help them engage with social supports that move them into the 75% group. Now, once again, I apologize because I'm pressing many hours into this short presentation, and hopefully you will be able to go to the Roadmap to Resilience book or to some of my other writings, or down the road even attend one of my presentations. I'm about to do 2 hours on trauma recovery and spirituality. In fact, most of these long-term workshops on treating prolonged and complicated grief or treating victims of violence and the like are available on the Melissa Institute. How do I cope with these stressful events? I am so moved by the kinds of stories that I encounter by those people who have been victimized and traumatized. So after the Newtown shooting, Alonzo shot all those children, I turned that into social action and put on the Melissa Institute and taught people how to use motivational interviewing with people who have had some kind of engagement with weapons in the NRA. In the aftermath of the Parkland High School shooting, we put together with the scientific board ways in which schools can be safer, what we could do in terms of guns. And in fact, that went out to 40,000 educators across the country. In the aftermath of the George Floyd incident, where Chauvin, in terms of police misconduct, murdered him, having his knee on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 20 seconds. The Melissa Institute put together a bystander intervention program that you could download for police. And in fact, that program appeared in the magazine for chief of police. In the aftermath of mass shootings, we've put together various kinds of ways in which you could identify a potential high-risk mass shooter. The Melissa Institute has taken the tragedy of the loss of Melissa and all the others who have died and tried to transform them into some good, of making a gift of this. The Melissa Institute has provided me with an outlet to maintain my own resilience. I am living the message my mother gave me, the model that she offered. I often ask clients the following question. I say to them, Don, I'd like to ask you something a bit different, a bit unusual. Do you ever find yourself out there in your day-to-day experience asking yourself the questions we ask each other right here? I recognize that I am a model for my patients. And my goal in bolstering resilience in the patients I see is to turn them into their own emotional detectives, to turn them into their own therapists, to put myself out of business. I have a preoccupation with the art of questioning. And I need them to question and monitor. Thank you for your attention for this first segment, and I would be delighted to take the next 15 minutes or so before we move into section 2 to get your response to this initial comments and any questions you may have.
Thank you, Don. Thank you again for sharing your wisdom with us and your years of work in this field. We do have a couple of questions we're going to start with. There's a question here that says, you have mentioned that the field of treating patients with PTSD is filled with a hype of over-exaggerated claims of efficacy, and that we should be on the lookout for this. What are some of the warning signs of hype?
All right, well, let me answer with a quick anecdote and then tell you about this. I was called upon to give a presentation at the Veterans Hospital. And the challenge for me was to help them draw a differential diagnosis for returning soldiers who have what are called traumatic brain injury because they've been exposed to improvised explosive devices, IEDs. And some may also have PTSD and the combination therein. Well, this is a challenging differential diagnosis, and this anecdote will take me right to the topic of hype. So in my haste to get through all this material, and you see I always have more material than time permits, I had an inadvertent faux pas. This is a true story. So I said, one of the problems for returning soldiers is that they've been exposed to, and here instead of saying IED, improvised explosive devices, I inadvertently said they've been exposed to exploding IUDs, intrauterine devices. I don't know where Freud would have a field day with that, but anyway. So I went on, and every once in a while I'd hear a snicker, just like I just heard now. And at the end, the psychiatric nurse came up to me and said, of all the problems they have in combat, least likely is an exploding intrauterine device. I said, what are you talking about? And she said, you kept saying IUD instead of IED. And I said, no way. The chief psychiatrist looked at me and said 5 times. And I said, that's really a unfortunate slip on my part, but it really reflects the state of the art in treating PTSD. Because if you look at people who are being treated by PTSD, you cannot provide a treatment for them without having an acronym-based therapy. The entire field is acronym-based. In fact, I'm convinced that people develop the acronyms and then they develop the therapies. So what is it that you do for therapy? Me, I do DTE, direct therapy exposure. What do you do? CPT, cognitive behavior. What do you do? EMDR. What do you do? Special. Here's the kicker that leads to the hype article. It turns out that one acronym-based therapy is no better than others. It turns out that focusing in on here and now is often as effective as having people go back and do then and there. Not only that, it turns out that the field of these acronym-based therapies are filled with exaggerated claims of efficacy. They are filled with neurobabble and psychobabble. So I, with the late Scott Lilienfeld, who unfortunately died, wrote an article called How to Spot Hype in the Field of Psychotherapy. And we provided a consumer's guide. And in fact, if you go to the Melissa Institute website, you can download that article. And keep in mind, everything on the Melissa Institute is free. So it turns out that people who get certificates do not get better results than others. It turns out that the quality and nature of the relationship is more important than the specific technique that you use. The field of psychotherapy, especially for trauma, is filled with energy-based interventions and experiencing kinds of things and brain. In fact, we have a list of all the warning signs. So if you get anything out of these 2 hours this morning, it is how to be a critical consumer. And you can start to wonder about how your own advocacy for a specific procedure may be similarly filled with hype. So, Etione, that's sort of my anecdote and sort of the cautionary note. You know, I'm an optimist at heart, but a skeptic. In fact, there's a beautiful article that we cite by Nissen and their colleagues. And the article is entitled, Love Yourself as a Person, but Doubt Yourself as a Therapist. That is, doubt yourself as a therapist. In fact, those therapists who got the best treatment outcomes were people who had professional self-doubt. Those who characterized themselves as experts, as not learning from their patients, did much poorer.
Thank you, Don, very much. Along these lines, we have a question from Terry's Michael. What are your thoughts on EMDR and other somatic interventions for PTSD?
I'm very dubious about those particular interventions. You can start to think about what is it that goes across all these acronym therapies. Because we know that if you remove the finger, the head injury, you remove some of the somatic things, they still work. So we got to think about what are the commonalities across each of these therapeutic procedures. You know, especially those that are so-called energy-based. So all of these have developed a therapeutic alliance to hear the story. They get the story of the rest of the story. They get people to retell the story and not keep it a secret. They often get the rest of the story from the person of what are the nature of survival skills. They highlight the strengths that people bring into bear. They teach a variety of emotion regulation techniques. They focus in on the nature of the generalization. You know, so when I debated Bessel van der Kolk, you know, he thinks that, you know, dismiss sort of a cognitive behavioral approach as if cognitions and emotions are separated. In fact, you could see the debate that I had with him read about the debate I had on the Melissa Institute. So, I have lots of anecdotes about my discussions about EMDR in particular. I don't question that they may be effective. I just want people to figure out what is it that contributes to those changes. You know, we now know that there are anecdotal accounts, for instance, of returning soldiers members who got better as a result of PTSD when they had to train a canary, when they had to swim with a dolphin, when they had to go back to the site of the event, when they, I mean, there's so many different ways to move people from 25 to the 75% group. Here's the question for us. What is it that each of these acronym-based therapies are doing that moves them to that 75 quality. In part, my answer is that it reduces the likelihood of negative thinking. If you look at all the things I put in table 1, any acronym therapy that reduces the likelihood of people engaging in each of those activities, I think increases the likelihood of moving. And that, as you'll see in your handout, I have a whole list there of the implications this has for therapy. We'll talk more about that in the second half.
All right, Don, I have 2 questions here from Ariela Tabachnik and one from Joe Katz that are related. I'm going to read you both. Do you think physical activity or movement may help to create a cohesive narrative? It's the first question. And the second one, can you speak of the benefits of exercise for PTSD and why you feel it's effective, if you do?
Well, there is a mode of intervention called behavioral activation that Dominion and others have indicated. And especially when there's PTSD accompanied by depression, we now know that exercise has beneficial effects at the neuropsychological level. So I'm not sure about activity during the course of a specific therapy per se, but we know that having people engage in some kind of behavioral activation, some kind of activity planning, something that has short-term, intermediate, and long-term goals, and that people can now not only do the exercise, but then talk to the therapist about what it was about the exercise that contributes to change, that the degree to which people take credit for. But at the physiological level, I'm a big fan of this. In fact, if you look at my handout, we're going to see that there are neurological benefits at the fMRI level of people engaging in reframing, of having social supports, of engaging nature and a sense of awe, of people engaging in exercise and the like. So I am for that. The big problem that you have is one of non-compliance. You know, people start exercise and then they sort of discontinuing. So how to get long-term behavioral changes is something I'll address in the second part of this. But no, I am a fan of having people have specific goals in mind and moving in the direction of that. In fact, collaborative goal setting is important. A key element of getting from the 25% group to the 75% group is, in fact, optimism, a sense of hope that fuel resilience and therefore the degree to which people can do these kinds of activities. In fact, there's even a suggestion that if you can just get people in the morning, those who are depressed and the like, to just make their bed, you know, as a first activity, it sort of says, I'm not going back and hide under the covers. It's a message to others, especially when these kinds of exercise are part of a social support group. You know, so you're picking up that whole social network that will be a positive event.
All right, here we have a question from John Eustace. Says, thank you for sharing, especially your personal story. How do you close a session? Our 15 minutes are up, so to speak, when the patient has just shared a very intense episode of personal trauma.
You know, that's a very, very good question. The problem is they're asking the wrong person. They're asking me. And what they should be doing is asking the patient. So if that happens in my sessions, I say to them, I noticed something, and I want to make sure you notice it too, that just as we were about to conclude, you shared something that was very personal. I want to thank you for sharing that, of being courage enough to do so. And I was wondering, is it okay for us to end now, or should we talk a little bit more about it? Would you like to just take a moment before you leave the office? I have another patient coming in, but not only that, I want you to know that you have my telephone number and you can access me down the road should there be some unfinished business. So my sense is, you know, these are really important concerns, and it would be my penchant to give the patient a variety of options. Remember, it is my ability to be human in response to that. I'm not wearing just a therapy hat, but of seeing someone who is emotionally distressed, you know. And the other kind of concern that I have is always one of safety, you know. So given that client's past history with regard to self-injurious behavior or suicidal ideation or what have you, you know, I might even say, you know, I could take a few minutes from this next patient, explain what we're doing, and see if we can adjust this, you know. So I want my humanity to reach out. I hope that captures the probe.
That's a wonderful answer, Don. One more question, I think, from this segment, and it's inviting you to put your consultant hat on. It's from Dr. Isaac Robertson, an old friend of the Institute. He said, I have recently started a resiliency club with a group of 4th and 5th graders from a general population in an elementary public school.
Right.
So far, we have focused on gratitude and acknowledging strength. Right. Some students recently just got their teacher back after she had been out on leave for medical reasons. Do you have any suggestions on how to use our time together, 1 hour a week, in the school that is most useful and fun for them in the short and in the long term?
Right. Well, first, I applaud the effort that you're making. The second is, I am absolutely obsessed and preoccupied by the issue of generalization. So one of the things I have done is consult to residential treatment programs for substance abuse, to school systems, to the VA. I work with head injured. The key question is, no matter how talented you are, no matter how good a therapeutic relationship, no matter how fun, and no matter what good skills you are teaching to these youth, the key is, what can you do to increase the likelihood that they will apply it once they're out of your 1 hour session? That's true not only with 1 hour, that applies to people who are in residential programs for 3 to 6 months. Here's the bottom line: nothing generalizes. We cannot just train and hope. So let me answer in the following way. If you go to the Melissa Institute website and click on Resilience Resources, you will be able to scroll down to a set of guidelines on how to enhance generalization, no matter what kinds of skills you're training, no matter what age group, no matter what setting. So there are things we should do before, during, and after any particular training session that will increase the likelihood of generalization and maintenance. So the quality and nature of the therapeutic alliance, your expectant attitude about how and where they could use it out there, the way in which you could teach skills up to the point of mastery, and then the degree to which you could put them in a consultative mode. That is, if you said to them, you know, I'm thinking of running another group of boys just like yourself, and I'm wondering, what suggestions would you guys, now that we've been meeting for a while, have to offer that? You know, when you give me this answer, this is my question: what could I do to help them remember to use this out there when I'm not on the meeting with them? Can we actually have a session whereby you teach what we've been talking about, this gratitude, the forgiveness, the sense of caring to others? What would you say? If your teacher came back and said, what did you do in that 1 hour? What is it that you learned? How could I see it? One of the things we know is teaching skills is inadequate. You need to get them to own the skill. It needs to be part of their mentalizing. They need to take your voice with them, just like I took my mother's voice with me. I applaud your efforts, but where and how can they show gratitude? How can they teach others? How can they go home and tell their parents, their teachers, and demonstrate it? You know that clock thing that I showed you? We actually taught youth, I'll describe it, how to do the clock with their parents, how to do the clock on their own. One last quick example. I don't know if you've ever had computer problems. Okay. So when I have computer problems, I go to someone who's more competent, right? And some of them are really knowledgeable, but they're not very good teachers, right? So they end up fixing my problem. They're about to leave. I go, don't go, and get your ass right there, okay? And until I can describe back and demonstrate what information they gave me, I do not own the skill.
All right. Thank you very much.
Make sure people have that in their repertoire.
Thank you very much, Don. I think it's a good moment then to transition to the second part of your course, your presentation. I want to first also express my gratitude to the audience there. Our box is filled with questions. We have a very inquisitive crowd, and we'll make sure that we get to as many of the questions as possible as we move to, and then pass on the questions to you, Don, for a later reflection. All right?
Yeah, they all have my email address, you know. And I'm an 81-year-old retired person. What better good things do I have to do? But...
All right.
Okay. We're going to talk about the rest of the lifespan, but let me preface this with the following. Envision a 17-year-old suicidal patient who was hospitalized for 25 months, at times confined to an isolated seclusion room because she engaged in self-injurious behaviors. She would burn her wrists with cigarettes. She would slash her body and do headbanging. However, one night she said, I have to tell my story. I owe it to others. I cannot die a coward. You know, one night I was kneeling in a prayer, looking up at a cross. The whole place became gold, and suddenly I felt this shimmering experience. And I just ran back to my room and I said, I love myself. You know, it was the first time I remember talking to myself in the first person. I actually felt transformed. This biographical account was offered by a good friend and esteemed colleague of Marshall Linehan, who went on to develop dialectical behavior therapy, a major intervention for borderline personality disorders, who went on to develop reasons for living scales in spite of. A 5-year-old child watched helplessly as his younger brother drowned. In the same year, he developed glaucoma. It began to darken his world, and his family was too poor to afford medical help that might have saved his sight. Both of his parents died during his teens. Eventually, he was sent to a state institution for the blind. But because he was African American, he was not permitted access to many activities, including music. Given the obstacles he faced, one could not have predicted that he would someday become a world-renowned musician named Ray Charles. You know, the story of humanity is the most remarkable story of resilience and courage that we can face. How do we become more ennobled? How do we view these people as models. And note that when we talk about resilience, we're not only talking about resilient individuals, we're talking about resilient families. We're talking about resilient communities and organizations. The child actor and director Ron Howard did a documentary called Rebuilding Paradise. I really encourage you to take a look at that. And one of the things that becomes interesting about Rebuilding Paradise is that this was a town in California that had completely burned down and people had not survived. And it's a documentary of how this entire community came together to evidence resilience. We live in tragic times. And for those children, some 170,000 have lost significant others in their lives due to COVID. Due to those who live in poverty and in violent areas, we need to consider how we can make our schools, our clinics, and our communities be resources for resilient engendering behavior. My scientific board colleague, Colleen Cicchetti, who works in Chicago, brought us a poem by a 10-year-old youth who lives in Chicago. I've included the poem in your handout, but permit me to read it. And then think about, if you're the mental health community at this boy's school, how do you proceed? If you were the mental health worker in Wisconsin, where this man recently drove through the crowd and killed multiple others. If you were the mental health worker at Oxford High School, if you were the mental health worker at Parkland High School, how do we identify kids who are high risk? And how do we bolster their resilience? Confined by violence, he says, I want to go outside and play right, but I can't. Not because it's a rainy day, it's to avoid the gunshots that may come my way. I want to go outside and play, but I can't. Not because I don't have a bike to ride. It's because my mom fears I'll be another victim of a senseless homicide. I want to go out and play, but I can't. Not because it's after hours, or even though it's way too dark. It's because of the gunshots that occur in my neighborhood park. I want to go outside and play, but I can't, not because I have no friends, but because of the violence that never ends. And finally, I want to go outside and play, but I can't, not because I don't deserve it. There's this thing called life, and I want to preserve it. How do we, as a society, how is we as a community of educators and therapists help these children bolster their resilience? I'm going to walk you through three aspects of ways in which I believe we can bolster resilience. Once again, you will see in the handout that I have included multiple other websites, suggestions, and the like. But given my limited time and also my desire to make sure we have time for questions, I will highlight a couple of things. What does it mean to have a trauma-informed school? How do we check the safety? How do we probe how kids get to school? How do we enlist bus drivers to identify who are the potential high risk? How do we make sure that teachers who have been with this boy prior to his 10 years of age, that their messages get passed along? How do we create an inviting learning environment. My family is filled with teachers, educators. And one of the things they highlight for me is that none of this can be done without the 114,000 principals in schools across the United States. That the superintendent and principal, from a kind of top down, needs to make a commitment to have a trauma-informed school. And once they get to school, we know that a byproduct of that kind of poverty, that kind of history of violence, either in the home due to exposure to domestic violence, due to street violence like this poem illustrates, due to victims of being bullied, or in fact being a bully victim, that the variety of victimization and trauma experiences can take a toll. And these tolls may in some sense be neurological in nature. That children who have experienced multiple adverse childhood experience show cerebral lateralization, so the left side of the brain is 7 times less active than the right side. That the corpus callosum, the connective tissues, and the commissures are compromised. That their emotionality, the amygdala, the hippocampus, and related lower brainstem can actually hijack the frontal lobe. Okay, that is the executive routines. That these children need what I call metacognitive prosthetic devices. Let me give you an example. I'm often called upon to present to educators, and I challenge them in the following way. I invite you to use this analogy if it would work in your communication with educators. I say to them, imagine that for a moment you have a child coming to your school, and for whatever reason that child is confined into a wheelchair. There are physical limitations that they have. Now, you, the educator, would never go out to that child in the wheelchair and say, look, you know, I've had enough with your excuses and the like. So you get that wheelchair up those 5 steps and do not be late, okay? I've had enough with your complaints. No. You, the educator, would never, ever say that to the child in the wheelchair. Get your chair up the stairs. You would say, no, we, the educators, have failed you by not providing you with a physical ramp to get your wheelchair into school. We have not provided you with a stick by the elevator. We have not provided you with supports in the bathroom to the shoes that you have. Instead of we're going to put Velcro in there. You realize that that child needs prosthetic tools. Now imagine that you have children who have been exposed to cumulative, and it's actually the accumulation of adverse childhood experience of 4 or more that has neurological sequelae. But these children look normal, right? They look like all the other kids. They're not in wheelchairs. But they have a left side of their brain that's less functioning. They have emotionality and shorter fuse. Okay? They may have concentration and attentional problems. These children need what we call metacognitive prosthetic devices. And in fact, if you go to the Melissa Institute, you will see that I've given entire presentations on what these look like in terms of the nature of the supports that they need in their particular area of advanced organizing, of memory prompts, of attentional supports. And moreover, if they come from poverty, a colleague, Andy B. Miller, and I did research on this to indicate that they're entering school less ready to benefit from it. In fact, they are entering school something of the order of anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 vocabulary words behind others. And it turns out that if you want to prevent violence, reading comprehension is a key element. In fact, if you can get kids to read at grade level 3, there's a high likelihood they will stay out of trouble with the law. So the Melissa Institute has actually put on its website 500 free movies under the literacy about how to close the gap when you have poverty. So when you have trauma and poverty, you can start to see how important this is. Not only that, these children who are exposed to violence on an ongoing basis are more likely to develop what are attachment disorders and relationships. Especially when we get to youth and others, one of my favorite questions to ask these youth is, let me ask you something a bit different, a bit unusual. If you were absent from school, who besides your friends would notice that you're missing and would miss you? Turns out that's a really clever question. In fact, one of the things we do with educators is we put in their lounge and ask them to sort of identify the names of boys and all the girls and how many they have a sense of connecting with. It turns out that school connectedness is an important kind of resilience engendering behavior. I've included in your handout a variety of other kinds of probes that you could ask. Especially among African-American youth, one of the most interesting questions is, when's the last time you went to church and who took you? It turns out that having those significant others, those guardian angels, are really critical in this particular domain. As we'll see when we get to youth, one of the major concerns is with regard to LGBTQ youth and how to bolster their resilience in the school system, about how to make school inviting, how we can engage parents as part of the therapeutic process becomes a critical component. One of the stems that we use with, especially in the aftermath of natural disasters and asking children, is to fill out the following questions. I ask children, can you tell me what you still have? I have. Can you tell me and yourself what you can still do? I can. And finally, this is the hardest one. Can you still tell me I am? Turns out I have, I can, and I am are really interesting questions. What people still have to get at the rest of the story instead of just focusing on the bad kind of events. I mean, clearly, you know, the level of distress in the parents is going to be a critical predictor of how well the children do. And you should obviously control the amount of exposure to TV and others that will exacerbate the stress and keep kids in the 25% group. As Ann Maston has documented in war-torn children, people living in horrific situations. Just think of all those families at the borders of Mexico and the United States. Your heart cries out for headlines that say that large swath of people in Afghanistan are going to starve to death. I mean, it's hard to watch the news and still be hopeful and resilient, to be optimistic given the nature of our society and the role that greed plays. Okay, so there are things that schools can do to enhance trauma-informed, and I can say a lot more about that. There are clearly one other item there, and that is often peers know their other fellow students as to who is particularly high risk. And, you know, there's a really kind of interesting measure that we've used called the class play measure, where you say to kids, you know, I'd like you to do something a bit different, a bit unusual, you know, and I want you each to think for a moment that you're a director in a play, right? And so what I'm going to do is read out names of parts that we want to put on the play, and you have in front of you the names of all the boys and all the girls in your class. And when I read a name, you tell me, who do you think would be really good to play that part? Okay, you ready? So I'm looking for someone who wants to play a really fun person at a party. You know, who would you really want to make? You know, I need someone to play the part of a bully, okay? I need someone who's had a really hard time and needs help, even though they may not even have the courage to ask for it themselves. So therefore, you can see that peer nomination, peer warning systems, as we've included in your Melissa Institute innumerable ways to address bullying and cyberbullying and the like, how to engage parents, how to do reading readiness, how to make schools more inviting, how to provide metacognitive prosthetic devices. All of those tools can be useful. At the clinic level, we've had entire presentations on what's called trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy for children who have experienced losses, adverse childhood experiences. There's a program by our colleague Marlene Wong and Lisa Jokovitz called CBITS, called Cognitive Behavioral Intervention for Trauma in the Schools. There are parent training programs. There's SNAP programs. Lena Aguimeri, one of our scientific board members, developed a program called SNAP, Stop Now and Plan, which has been effective in teaching young children parent-child interactions to stop now and plan, this kind of derivative of our own self-instructional training that we started many years ago. And what's really fascinating is that not only does it work in terms of reducing the likelihood of aggression or violence and the like, but it also, as she's demonstrated recently, actually changed fMRIs in the brain. Remember, engaging in resilience engendering self-regulatory behaviors not only changes behavior, but changes the nature of the transmission and structure of the brain. Once again, I have included in your handout descriptions of a variety of parent training programs. The bottom line in doing any of these interventions is twofold. One is you need to be racially and culturally sensitive when conducting these kinds of parent training programs. And I've included a variety of these. The second, you have to individually tailor the intervention in a way that will increase the likelihood of generalization and transfer. I said not only do we have resilient individuals, we also have resilient families. And there are now a number of parent training programs that increase the nature of parent communications that reduce parent-adolescent conflict, programs that increase the likelihood of monitoring of the child's behavior. The recent tragic shooting of a parent buying a 13-year-old a gun, okay, and not protecting itself, of parents being as responsible as possible in monitoring the various kinds of Instagram, the TikTok, and all the kinds of things that are now being implicating and having a negative effect on the mental health of youth. And finally, if we want to bolster resilience, there needs to be some work at the community level, okay? We now know that there are a variety of preventative programs, the old Ypsilanti, the Apperson thing. These programs are preschool. And when they do longitudinal long-term studies, they see the benefits that accrue from those critical moments early on in development. There are some really interesting programs out of the country Iceland that I cite, that where they provide after-school programs, where they actually try to reduce the level of stress in the home, the way in which they, for substance abuse, use harm reduction and other kinds of techniques. So there are a number of interventions at the school, clinic, and community level. Why do this? Well, for some people, it's not just to being good neighborly and helpful and reducing the gaps in poverty. Here's a bottom line, okay? that I've been called upon to highlight. If you do reading comprehension, if you do these resilience engendering behaviors, if you increase the likelihood of parent involvement, you increase the likelihood of students graduating from high school. Don't just look at the front door, look at the back door. And what do we know? That every student who graduates high school will make approximately $260,000 more than those who did not graduate. And of that $260,000, okay, they will pay approximately $100,000 in taxes. So every time someone drops out of high school, you go 100,000, 200,000, 300,000, okay? And if you look at the cohort of dropouts in California, do you know how many millions of dollars they are losing? I mean, sure, we could tax the rich and they will resist. But how about bolstering the resilience of the young so that they pay taxes and can support me in my Social Security in old age? What about adolescents? Okay. Adolescents are interesting and perhaps most challenging. You know, whenever I see an adolescent in therapy, they always convey to me that I'm always seeing the wrong person. Yeah, I really should be seeing their parents. You know, and we have, and you can go on the Melissa Institute, included a variety of interventions for different groups of adolescents. One that I mentioned before is the LGBTQ community, especially transgender youth. And in fact, they have a suicide rate that's 3 to 4 times higher than the general population. And I have included in the Melissa Institute a set of guidelines on how to bolster resilience in LGBTQ population. Ways in which we can make the school environment more inviting, the way in schools can hook up with parents of P flag, the way in which schools can have groups that support gay, the way in which teachers can embed the history of victimization of gays as part of their curriculum, of the way in which we can now incorporate the history of the United States, of slavery and the like, as part of lessons that we can learn. I've also been involved, and we've had presentation on human trafficking, which is a major issue, and I directed you to a couple of other resources by John Briere and Cheryl Lackton, who have developed particular therapeutic interventions. I've also talked about how we can reach out to that particular target group in order to bolster their own kind of resilience. There is a good deal of material online on ways in which to treat individual adolescents who are depressed and suicidal, not only by myself, but a former student of mine, Jonas Sano, have also highlighted the high kind of suicidal rate that's occurring, especially among African-American boys at this time, the way in which we can reduce the likelihood of academic pressure. A fair amount of studies on the degree to which that becomes interesting. The way in which we can reduce microaggressions, especially among minority youth, Latino and African Americans. There are studies, for example, of the number of times youth get stopped by the police and for no particular reason except for their racial thing or giving some other kind of provocation, and the degree to which that has a kind of cumulative impact in undermining the nature of resilience and inadvertently actually increasing the likelihood of some kind of antisocial behavior. I worked for a number of years with Native populations, both in the United States and in Canada. And in fact, one of the articles that's online is called 35 Years of Working with Suicidal Patients, Lessons Learned. And one of the things that became rather interesting in working with them, a two-part anecdote here. One is we looked at the fact that there are over 400 tribes in the United States, Native tribes. And there are some tribes in the United States where the suicide rate among adolescents is well beyond the 12 per 100,000, which is normative. And it's in the high 30s. But there were also other tribes where the suicide rate was less than 12, it was like 8 to 10. So, I mean, that became an interesting detective work, because what is it that distinguishes the youth who were having low suicide rates, even though they were both exposed to poverty, discrimination, hopelessness, domestic violence, substance abuse, and the like? And one of the things that became apparent is it had to do with intergenerational transmission of resilience. That each of us and each of those people were members of a tribe of sorts. And if we look at the population among the youth who had a low suicide rate, one of the things that they did was to reestablish wise cultural practices. They actually jump-started their healing process. They were able to restore traditional life and deeply cultural behaviors and rituals. That is, insofar as these youth identify with their community, the familiar resources, they actually had them engage with the elders and learn the stories. They had them engage in altruistic behavior of helping others. They used spiritual activities like the medicine wheel and the notion of harmony. They tried to unite the mind, the body, the sense of energy and spirit. You know what they did most importantly? They shared stories. They shared stories of resilience and survival that people inculcated. They were able to engage in a whole variety of healing processes. In fact, there's a movement called radical healing, where instead of blaming the individual and just focusing in on their symptomatic presentations of depression or PTSD or anxiety or anger and the like, that we can help reframe that as ways in which they can reformulate it into a social action, that they can understand as part of the psychoeducational process, the factors that led to that, and how did their forefathers go about surviving in that fashion. Each one of these topics on how to bolster resilience in children and their families, a way in which to bolster resilience in adolescents, ways to bolster resilience in adults, elderly, and the trauma, could have been a topic unto itself for 2 hours. I cannot conclude this presentation with the latter two groups. And that is, first of all, the elderly. You know, as someone who's 81, whose vision is compromised, who have a number of other medical problems, okay? It's sort of body maintenance, you know, and now the saddest thing as elderly is I have 4, you know, I actually have 7 grandchildren, 4 of whom are in Canada. And I have not seen the 4 in Canada for 2 years. For 2 years. I mean, Zoom is only so good. So one of the things we know about the elderly is that the best predictor of morbidity and mortality is loneliness. In fact, loneliness is indeed, and the sense of social isolation is more predictive of long-time mobility and mortality. A second key element that goes back to the question that was asked before has to do with inactivity. My daughter-in-law in Burnaby actually studies falls in the elderly. She has this wristband that counts the number of times you leave the house, that you move around. And activity correlates with a variety of neurotransmissions of the norepinephrine and dopamine and so forth. And if you're elderly and a couch potato for 6 or more years, you're really shortening your lives in significant ways. Moreover, the elderly have the potential of also being re-victimized or victimized in the first place, and therefore there's a need there. There are forms of therapy that we could use with the elderly. I've included in your handout that, in fact, the elderly do better who are depressed on cognitive behavior therapy than those who are younger. That there's a certain kind of wisdom that comes with the age. There's often a kind of reminiscence therapy that has been found to be effective with regard to this, and nurtures a kind of cognitive flexibility. And most importantly, there's a sense of generativity. I'm 81. The average age of someone like me is approximately 88 before they die. If you trust the norms, although my esteemed colleague, Aaron Beck, who recently died, the father of cognitive therapy, he lived to be 100. I've often wondered what it is about cognitive therapists that make them so effective. And my answer is that I think that cognitive therapy and cognitive behavior therapy works because it helps to prevent depression in psychotherapists. So if you're getting depressed on your job, it's because you have embraced the wrong theoretical perspective, okay? Because when I listen to these tales of woe, of all the kinds of victimization that my clients have gone through, natural disasters, personal losses, victims of violence in one form or another, while I listen in the most compassionate, attentive fashion possible, I realize that there's a story beyond what I'm hearing about. And it's my job, especially if you get to the case conceptualization model I developed, to have no one leave my office without the rest of the story. Maybe it was due to my mother, but I refused to get depressed. I'm basically an optimist. And that's part of what gets me through this last element of how to bolster resilience in psychotherapists. Once again, if you go to the Melissa Institute, you can see my workshop on how to bolster resilience at the level of trauma therapists, and what to do with the individual, what to do at the collegial, and what to do at the organizational levels that will help you survive, especially in this challenging times of telehealth. The first patient I ever had as a graduate student, very first patient I had at the Danville VA, died by suicide. And I must tell you that I thought that was the end of my professional career. I felt that I was responsible, that I had missed out in some way. And over the course of 50 years of doing clinical work and research and consultation, we've had multiple instances of where people have died by suicide, patients. And that is one of the most devastating impacts that it could have on a therapist. And I've included in this handout how I coped and how frequent this is among case therapists, especially when they have long histories of victimization and co-occurring disorders like substance abuse and depression. how do you learn to leave it at the office? How do you develop a quality of life as a therapist that reinforces your positive outlook? How do you try not to be the fixer of PTSD, but a curious guide? How do you model a style of questioning and curiosity that you're trying to nurture in your patients? How do you try to help them identify the nature of the resources that they bring in that maybe they're not fully aware of that we can access? How do you do active aftercare, discharge planning? You know, the Therapeutic Alliance doesn't end just at the end of your sessions. You need to be able to convey your availability and interest, your commitment to them as a person. Being a psychotherapist is a challenging but noble profession. And for all of you who have tuned in and for whom you can share this video, I applaud your effort and encourage you to help people fall into the 75% group. Thank you for your attention and interest. Thank you for putting up with my personal anecdotes. I look forward to your questions.
Don, thank you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for both speaking from with your intellect and with your heart. And I think the comments that I'm seeing and the questions reflect that. I think you have touched both the minds and the spirits of the people who are listening to us today. You have made several references to the particularly difficult times that we are now living, you personally, and I share with you the inability to be in contact with my son, as we had talked about before. And I have a question for you in terms of then things that we can do now to deal with the challenges that we're facing. For example, given the mass number of deaths as a result of COVID, how can we help bolster survivors' resilience?
That's a really big question. You know, I said we're coming up to 800,000 in the United States. It's approximately 5 million around the world, and who knows where it's going to go. You know, clearly the most important issue that you and I actually have addressed is how can we help people not fall into that group of grief, you know, and we've written an article on how to convince people to wear masks and get vaccinated and the like. So I'm not going to, people could read about that we've written about it. Mm-hmm. You know, there is a handout on the Melissa Institute, a workshop that I give on how to treat individuals who have prolonged and complicated grief and moreover traumatic bereavement, where there's sudden deaths and the like. And I encourage people to go to that presentation. One of the important things is to recognize that the task of therapy is to recognize the reality of the death, but to change the nature of the relationship with those who have died. That is, there's a key element here of having the relationship with the deceased be revised and altered. In fact, to think about the variety of therapeutic procedures like empty Gestalt chairs and other ways that people can write letters and memorialize. And one of the things that's really important in this particular area is the degree to be culturally sensitive with regard to dealing with those who are grieving. Banana and others have indicated that most people will be impacted, okay, but only about 70% will go on to be resilient. You know, and in fact, the data indicates that if people are struggling, if they have co-occurrence of both trauma and resilience, that group is more likely to develop post-traumatic grief post-traumatic growth, and that they'll change their priorities, develop deeper relationships and the like. So the first kind of thing, and you can go to the Robert Niemeyer website called the Portland Institute for Transition and Loss. They have a variety of techniques. You can look at some of the materials that we have put on there as well. One of the two kind of cautionary notes that I would highlight for those working with those who are grieving is to be culturally sensitive and not pathologize any response. I recently gave a workshop on this and someone said, you know, we have a patient here who's hallucinating about her dead husband. And, you know, I was immediately responsive to say, you know, we should not characterize that coping effort as hallucination. Don't pathologize people's coping effort, you know, and therefore, even using dissociation and other kinds of withdrawal techniques may be highly adaptive. So be respectful of that. The other kind of cautionary note that I highlighted is that many people who work as grief counselors and the others have embraced Kubler-Ross stages of that people go through various stages of reaction in the aftermath of loss. And if you look at the research by Roxanne Silver and Camille Wortman and so forth, there are no stages that people go through. In fact, if you suggest to clients that they have to feel anger or bargaining and so forth, you have the potential of making it worse for the individual. This really bothers me in terms of hype, because there's people like Kessler and others who are now talking about the 6th stage of grief. Well, we don't even have evidence for the first 5. I mean, you know, I can go on and on. You know, you just twig me in terms of the bullshit and hype that goes on in this field, you know. So be a critical consumer. Recognize that people are more resilient. Be culturally sensitive. Ask them what they could do. We've developed a coping with grief checklist where we've asked people to indicate where they have experienced grief in the past. And we ask people to go through this and see if there's anything they've done that may be on the list. Is there anything on the list that they want to add? Is there anything they're doing that we can add to the list? So there are a number of interventions that we've developed that are accessible. I'd be happy to direct people to.
In the spirit of this critical attitude that you were describing, we have a question from Carla Garcia asking, why is spirituality so effective in healing trauma? Do you think it's effective? As you think you mentioned.
I missed
why is spirituality so effective in healing trauma?
Wonderful question. Okay. Right. So some of the people that keep some of the things that keep people in the 25% group is having spiritual struggles. And in fact, Pargament and Exline just wrote a book that I recommend on how to handle spiritual struggles. And there are different kinds of struggles that people have. I mean, people may feel that God is punishing them, that they have sinned, that they're deserving, that God has abandoned them, and the like. And when we look at spirituality, it can have a down effect too, especially if you're hooking up with a community of other religious figures, you know, community that rejects you. And I can give you multiple examples from my own clinical experiences therein. But spirituality serves a variety of purpose. And if you go once again to my handout, you'll see that I've enumerated these. One is it's part of a meaning-making activity. I had the good fortune once meeting Elie Wiesel, who wrote the book Night and on Trial. And he reports the situation in the concentration camp where the Jewish community came together and they put God on trial. You know, they actually had a prosecutor and a defender. They had a formal trial. And they had a jury. And the jury found God guilty, okay, of abandoning, of being evil. But as soon as the trial was over, they all went back to their respective bunks and prayed. So struggles and resilience can commingle. And as they note in their book, if you look at the role of spirituality, it provides a fork in the road. And that the major way that people cope with trauma is in some sense, some form of spirituality. That you're part of that community. Not only that, if you are lonely and you don't have any other social supports, you're a divinity figure. Jesus, Buddha, Moses, whatever it is, may be a social support that you could turn to. I can go on, but one of the
Mhm.
things to keep in mind is how do we assess? The sad fact is that most therapists do not ask about spiritual struggles. They don't ask about spiritual struggles. And the data indicates that anywhere from 40 to 70% of clients we have are in some form of having struggle. It's important for we as therapists to ask clients, what do they think is causing their presenting problem? And what do they think it will take to change? Some people, I've lectured for all kinds of religious groups, and some people say God is punishing me. Okay, I have sinned. I have violated my moral compass. In fact, the work by Litz and their colleagues is focused in on soldiers who are suffering from moral injuries, who describe themselves as having a dead soul. What is the story that our clients are telling us? And is some kind of spiritual struggle part of that story? Do we have the ability and courage to ask about it? And if we get it, what are the variety of ways? It's also worth knowing that there's evidence-based, spiritually oriented therapies that I include in that handout.
Thank you, Don. One more question before we leave you for your lovely wife and the weekend. You talked about your preoccupation with the art of questioning, and the art of questions. What advice do you have for clinicians, old and new, who want to develop this art?
Limit your questions to how and what. Do not ask why questions. So when I do timeline 2, which is the sense of what they've done, what they've accomplished in spite of the islands of competence, I will highlight for them, how did you do that? What did you do? How did you overcome? Why questions are not really very productive. So I am now putting together my legacy course of some 30 hours, and I've gone through the core task of psychotherapy. And one of the lectures there, I included the best questions that I could find. So I have indicated different kinds of questions. The one thing that I would encourage the therapist to do is to read about motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing is most likely the best evidence collection of questions that you start off with expressed empathy for the person. You develop a discrepancy between how things are and how they like them to be. You avoid argumentation. You roll with resistance, and you provide social support. So I'll conclude with the following. When I see a client, I say the following to them. Can I take a moment to explain what I do for a living and see if this fits with what you're expecting as you come in here? You see, I work with folks just like yourself and try to find out how things are right now in your life. And moreover, how would you like them to be? In your efforts to change things, what have you tried in the past? What's worked? What didn't work? I'd like our efforts to be informed by your previous attempts. What would you have difficulty in following through with? Is there anything back then that you were satisfied with that you think we could build on? And if we work together, and note I embed in my social discourse, if we work together, and I hope we can, how would we know if we're making progress? What would each of us see? What would other people notice? And one last question, if I may. One last question. Can you foresee, can you, the patient, envision anything that might get in the way? That you might be able to learn to anticipate and address if it occurs? Note, every single question I asked was a how and why question. I didn't ask why. Okay, how are things now in your life? How would you like them to be? What have you tried? What's worked, what hasn't, what do you have difficulty following through? If we work together, how would we know if we're making progress? What would we see? What would other people also notice? Can you foresee, can you envision anything that might get in the way? Now, I don't ask all those questions in that bullet form, but the art of questioning is the most valuable tool that we have in our repertoire. The ability to establish, maintain, and monitor a therapeutic alliance. Those are the two things that will lead to better treatment outcomes. Please stay safe. Thank you for your attention and interest, and feel free to share this video with others. It's a freebie from the Melissa Institute.
Thank you, Don, for this important and inspiring conversation, especially coming to the end of this extraordinary year that we've gone through. I want to thank also the audience from all over the world that joined us today. Invite you to continue as we move on into the next year to participate of our series on innovations in violence prevention series. Remember that everything that the Institute does is for free for our communities, now global communities as well. And
let me interject that, Tioni.
Yes.
We do accept donations.
Absolutely, we do. I was going to go there. The work that we do is possible precisely because of the generosity of people like you who are watching today. So I hope that you would consider, as you're coming to the end of the year, donating to the Institute. I want to wish you all a very peaceful and healthy holiday season. And I really, for all of us, 2022 filled with a lot of beautiful things. I think we deserve it. We've been through a lot, and thank you, Don, for helping us get to the end. All right. Thank you all.